Good evening. I'm Beth Hillman, the President and CEO of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. It's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to Lessons from the Edge. As always, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our museum members and to those who are tuning in for our live web broadcast. Over a year ago, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, escalating long-standing hostilities into a war that has killed tens of thousands, displaced millions, and reshaped geopolitics and the global economy. To help us understand the history of the region and the current state of the war, we're privileged to have Marie Yovanovitch, whose distinguished service has given her a front row seat to this history, as well as tremendous insight into the region and the role of diplomacy in today's world. Ambassador Yovanovitch spent 33 years in the Foreign Service, including in the countries of the former Soviet Union. She began her career in Ottawa and was assigned to Moscow, London, Mogadishu, and as Deputy Director of the Russian desk at the Department of State. She served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic from 2005 to 2008, as the Ambassador to the Republic of Armenia from 2008 to 2011, and as Ambassador to Ukraine from 2016 to 2019. Her New York Times best-selling memoir, Lessons from the Edge, offers insight into the post-Soviet Union politics of Russia and Ukraine while paying homage to foreign service officers and the important work that they do, and exploring the events that led to her removal as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine in 2019. There will be a book signing of her work immediately after tonight's program outside in the auditorium. A career member of the Senior Foreign Service, Ambassador Yovanovitch has earned the Senior Foreign Service Performance Award 8 times, the State Department's Superior Honor Award 9 times, as well as receiving 2 Presidential Distinguished Service Awards and the Secretary's Diplomacy and Human Rights Award. She's currently a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a non-resident fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Please join me in welcoming Marie Yovanovitch for a conversation with our museum director, Clifford Chanin.
Thank you, Beth. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see some new faces on top of it's nice to see the familiar faces that I see. So welcome to everybody. I do think if you have the time afterwards to go outside and get the ambassador to inscribe a book to you, because it really captures, I think, a lot about what it is to be a diplomat in difficult places and in difficult times. Of course, some of those difficulties were coming from the rear rather than from the front, but one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and this cuts to the end of the book, but I think it's a really important point. You were, and you describe the various ways in which you felt this, you felt very much that you had been left to hang out to dry in the situation involving Ukraine, the president's phone call, which happened after your term in office, but nonetheless, these efforts to sort of implicate Ukrainian politics in American politics. And you were quite critical of then Secretary of State Pompeo, who never really stood up and said, this is not what we should be doing to our own ambassadors. And we'll talk more about the detail of how that happened, but I'm thinking more about the impact on the Foreign Service, the impact on the thousands of Foreign Service officers who are out there in the world who need a strong lifeline back home. And I'm wondering if, now it's a couple of years after this incident involving you, what you think has been done to damage the department and whether some of that at least has been restored in the years since.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a really good answer for you. I think that, you know, in our system and in most systems around the world, there's a career foreign service in the State Department, our diplomats, and then there's a layer of you know, political appointees who are the president's men and women, the president being our elected official, and the political appointees who are there doing his, and one day it will be hers, her bidding. And so, you know, in the best of times, it's a really good team. You know, it's a team effort to to advance the interests of the American people. There are always tensions. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican president or a Democratic president. There are always some kinds of tensions with the career bureaucracy. But mostly it's surmountable, because we all have, the same goals, right, to advance and defend our interests. So with the Trump administration, it was just a very unusual administration in many different ways. And I'm sure the people in this audience know that quite well. But Secretary Pompeo, and before him, Secretary Tillerson, really took a number of steps to basically weaken the State Department. I mean, Tillerson had a whole program where people who departed their jobs were not replaced, sort of bureaucratically kind of finding ways to weaken the State Department, not just the Foreign Service, but the Civil Service. And Pompeo initially seemed like a breath of fresh air because he reversed some of the things that Tillerson had done. But then I think in his zeal to stay on the right side of a very, frankly, mercurial president, he too, undermined the State Department in many different ways, including by not providing, the leadership and the public leadership for the people and what our mission should be. So, one of the things that always stands out in my mind is President Trump having a press conference at the White House with Secretary Pompeo by his side. And President Trump talks about the State Department, and then he says something, and this is not a direct quote, but he says something about, and all those deep state people. Pompeo, the two of them are just yucking it up and implying that somehow the people who work at the State Department are not loyal to our government. And I thought it was a real low. And it was pretty emblematic for me of where the State Department had gone. And then just, my story is relatively well known, but the real danger of what was happening in terms of people around the president undermining the president's representative to Ukraine is that, we do hard things in often difficult places around the world. And the compact is that your government, when they're instructing you to do certain things, to do hard things that may not be welcomed by particular individuals or even by the host government, but your government stands behind you. And that's not what was happening when I was in Ukraine. I didn't even understand all of the ins and outs of it while I was there, and even for some time afterwards, because a lot of investigative journalists did a lot of good work, and there's still information coming out about all the ins and outs. But I think when I was removed from Ukraine, it kind of sent a shudder through the State Department because I wasn't the only one who was in a challenging assignment. There are other ambassadors, other people doing hard things in hard places, and they're wondering, how far do I push on some of these things, and is this something I really need to do, even though it's an instruction from Washington? And so, that's a slippery slope.
How did this manifest in terms of what some of your colleagues might have said to you, or ways in which, without getting into people coming up to you and saying or writing on your behalf, but ways in which you could feel this impact because of what had happened to you and because of some of the bigger issues of what was or wasn't being defended in the State Department?
I'd rather not get into that. I think those are personal conversations.
But there were things that people were expressing to you.
Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
So,
I just feel it's not my place to tell other people's stories.
Fair enough. Your story is rooted essentially in the Foreign Service interaction with the countries of the post-Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And so your three ambassadorships in Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Ukraine were all of these were once Soviet republics. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, to sort of cast through all three of those experiences, your sense of, and you'd served also in Uzbekistan and Russia as well, so this mm-hmm. was an area that you saw the whole transformation. the end of the Soviet Union was not the end of Soviet culture and influence and perspective, neither in Russia nor in the surrounding states. And I'm wondering about how you were dealing with, because the stories that you tell in Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Ukraine are very consistent in terms of corruption, in terms of lack of democratic practice, in terms of the strongman politics. And so this was what you were wrestling with in all of these assignments and others. And in fact, this seems very much that sort of the Soviet style of governing and management and the relation between the state and the people didn't really change that much, certainly in the immediate aftermath, and perhaps even still to this day.
Yeah, I think that's right. So when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, in pretty much every single one of the republics was ruled by the same person that had ruled that republic the day before. The titles changed. Before they were the secretary of the Communist Party for the Republic of Armenia or something like that, and then they became presidents or prime ministers through elections. But they were the same people who had been brought up in the Soviet way, who had been working through the Soviet system for many, many years. The break apart of the Soviet Union, on the one hand, was very, very slow. It was many decades in the making, right? But on the other hand, when it came very fast. And I think that most people, most leaders were not prepared. And so, as the US and other countries sort of approached these countries to establish diplomatic relations, to find out, what was going to happen, what the challenges would be, what would happen. Would there be civil wars? Would there be wars? What kind of future would these countries want for themselves? They pretty much all said they wanted to be democracies and market economies. But, again, this was from a group of men. I mean, they were all men. Who wanted, who had grown up in the Soviet era. They had, if you'll forgive me for saying this, I mean, I don't think they had any idea of what they were actually expressing, of what it would actually mean to create a democracy in a post-Soviet state, what a market economy would be. And most of them asked us for help, not just us, France, Germany, the EU, other countries, other institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. And so, we had a choice. Do we want to help these countries or not? And I think, it was unanimous, basically, that these countries deserved our help. They wanted to make a transition. This would be good for those countries, right? If they move from a Soviet-style command economy to a market economy, to a democracy. And it would be good for us because we would have trading partners. We would have, our companies could invest. It would be good for jobs in America. And, historically, our best partners are other democracies. So we really saw this as, a net positive. And so I think you're absolutely right that the Soviet legacy, I mean, each of these countries that you've mentioned has their own, traditions and cultures. And now with the war in Ukraine, I think we're finding out a lot about how distinct and vibrant and rich the Ukrainian culture and language and people are. That's true for all of the republics. But there was this Soviet overlay, and for a lot of them, there was also a Russian imperial overlay even before that, that stamped out some of that distinctiveness and created a form of government that really penalized any kind of initiative. That also, I think, made it hard to make a transition because if your whole life you're waiting for the Communist Party to tell you what to do or what not to do, all of a sudden, you're in, the new Republic of Ukraine or Armenia, and people, to a certain extent, the leadership, maybe not the people, but the leadership was still looking to Moscow for advice and, how do we do these things? And so there was a gradual weaning. But the transition took a long, long time, as you would expect. I mean, think about, the United States. I mean, where were we 10 years after independence? It took us a long, long time too. And so, I think it's to be expected.
But your job as ambassador is essentially to walk that fine line because whatever the popular sentiment is, the government is in many of these cases anyway, sort of holding back and is sort of more oriented towards Moscow than it is towards the West. And you have to have official relationships and deal with the government authorities. And yet you can see at the same time, they may not be representing at least what you can sense of what the people want. And so talk a little bit about that in terms of the ambassador's function and how you're balancing your sense of what the society is looking for as opposed to what the government is insisting on.
Well, the first thing, just to remind, I know you and everybody else in this room knows this, but American ambassadors are about American interests and American values. And I've been lucky, at least in my own view, that I've worked in a lot of different countries where there is a real coincidence of, what we do to project our own values, to project our own interests and protect our own interests in the countries that I've served in. So that's a real positive. It doesn't always work out that way. But you're right. There's always kind of a balance that has to be found between U.S. interests and U.S. values. They don't always coincide, and which gets the priority at any given time, and that can often be quite difficult. But also between the host country as well, and where they want to go. So, as I said before, with the countries of the former Soviet Union, we thought that helping them make that transition, since that's what they told us they wanted to do, we weren't imposing this on them. They said that they wanted to do this, and they asked for our assistance. So we thought that was in our interests, and that's what we did. I think it took a while. So just like looking at Ukraine as an example, it took a while for civil society. Civil society is all of us. It's ordinary people doing ordinary things. Starting a Boy Scout troop in your little town, or beautifying the library because the town budget doesn't have enough money, and so a group of citizens get together and plant tulips so that the town square or the library looks nice. Getting your mayor to put in a traffic light near the school because there have been too many accidents. That sort of thing is what civil society is all about. People not waiting for the government to do stuff, but taking responsibility for our lives, for making things better in our communities, and urging our politicians to do more. So that's what civil society is, and we take that for granted in the United States because that's how we live our lives. That's not true in many countries around the world, and certainly was not true in the Soviet Union, and is part of the legacy. And so in the beginning, I think, after 1991, citizens didn't really know what to do. They were still waiting. But by the time I got there for the first time in 2001, that was 10 years after independence. And there was already, the beginnings of an active civil society. It was new to people, and they were trying to figure it out. It wasn't always welcomed by the government. And there was a burgeoning class of investigative journalists, and they were starting to write articles about corruption in the government, and starting, that process that we expect from journalists and from journalism of holding government accountable. And that was, you could already see that in 2001, which had not been present before. And then, of course, in 2004, you have the Orange Revolution, where the citizens of Ukraine came together and said, these presidential elections have been rigged, and we are not going to stand for it. And they had a peaceful demonstration, and they actually got the results that they were looking for. It was pretty remarkable, and it was peaceful, and that was also very remarkable. And those citizens that had kind of come together to create the Orange Revolution, most of them went back to their ordinary lives, because they figured, okay, now we've got the president we want, he's a reformer, it's going to be good, and we'll let the politicians do the work. It didn't quite work out the way people had hoped. And so in 2014, when Yanukovych turned his back essentially on the EU, and first students started demonstrating, and then others started demonstrating, and they, in the end, even though a deal was done, Yanukovych fled the country anyway because he was afraid of what was going to come next. And those people who created the Revolution of Dignity, as it was called in 2014, they decided that they were not going to do what they did in 2004. They had a lot more experience, both within Ukraine as well as working abroad. They had a lot of skills. And so some reformers joined the government. Some, stayed in, they created various platforms. Some stayed in civil society and helped from outside of the government to do the reforms that the Ukrainian people were demanding. And just to remind people, the word revolution of dignity, or the phrase revolution of dignity, I mean, what that really means is, I want to be treated with dignity. I want to live in a country that is ruled by law, not by, who I know or what job I do. I want to be treated the same as the president, according to the law. And that was a really important statement, I think, from the Ukrainian people. And a lot of important reforms happened in those first couple years after the Revolution of Dignity. And now we are seeing the continuation of this, I think, in Russia's brutal war against Ukraine and the Ukrainian people's response.
So let's go back, because each of those incidents that you mentioned, whether it's the Orange Revolution or the Revolution of Dignity and all of the things in between, have essentially been cited by Putin as incitements against Russia that are motivated, in fact, by the West, and that somehow are deflecting Ukraine from its true alliance, in essence. And so all of this is building, and Russia is watching this. And you had experience in Russia. You were in that first period of time, the number 2 in the American embassy in Ukraine, as this was building. What was the sense of what Russia would do in response to these incidents? Because we see now where this has built to, but the Russians are watching. They have a very close attention to Ukraine, and clearly, based on these current events, feel a claim to Ukraine. What was the sense in the embassy of how this was going to press the Russians in one direction or another?
So I left in the summer of 2004, and the Orange Revolution started shortly thereafter. Similar to the way I think we feel today is that the Ukrainian people get to decide their own future. They are a distinct people. They have a distinct culture. They have their own history, and they have their own country framed by international borders that Russia has recognized multiple times. In fact, the only time I've met President Putin was in August of 2001, when he flew down to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians celebrate the 10th year of their independence. So just saying that he was recognizing those borders then. And he continued to recognize those borders. And I think, it's clear, especially in retrospect. I mean, I think sometimes it's hard to know in the moment how these things are going to develop, but it's clear, looking back, people say, oh, well, was it NATO expansion? Was it this? Was it that? I mean, first of all, I don't think my own view, and reasonable people can disagree, my own view is not that Putin changed over time, but that he was very, very constant. He was a KGB man, and he still is. I think that it wasn't NATO enlargement, which by and large happened without too much protest from the Russians. It was the so-called colored revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. The Kyrgyz had the Tulip Revolution. Is that right? The Georgians had the Rose Revolution. And I think that was very sobering for Putin, because if the people could rise up and replace a leader, even if it was peaceful, as it basically was in all those countries, and nobody, none of the leaders lost their lives or anything, that's a real affront to a strongman like Putin. And if it could happen there, could it happen in Russia? I think that was some of the thinking. And what we know now is that, fast forward to Gaddafi's demise, which was obviously a terrible death for anybody. We have information which is now public that Putin would like sit in, one of his palaces and obsessively watch the video of that gruesome death. So I think it had an effect. And I think for Putin, if you are somebody of his makeup, where he doesn't believe in democracy. I don't think he believes that the people have, their own will. And so clearly there had to be an outside agent. And so who is the outside agent? Well, of course, it's got to be, the evil Satan. It's got to be the U.S. It's got to be NATO. It's got to be some outside force. And, that too feeds the paranoia of if the U.S. was doing this in these countries, could the same thing happen in Russia? And I'll tell you, as somebody who was not actually present in any of these countries during those revolutions, but working in other places in the department, I wish I could tell you that we foresaw everything that was going to happen. No, it doesn't happen that way, because popular uprisings are exactly that. They're popular uprisings. The people themselves don't know what is going to happen next. And so it's hard for me to know how we in the U.S. would have known what would happen, or that we were somehow responsible.
2014 looms as a very important turning point in all
Yes.
of this, because that's the point, first in Crimea and then in the Donbas, which is the eastern Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. The Russians come in either openly or under some sort of a fig leaf that no one believed anyway. But all of a sudden, it's moved from whatever their concerns are to taking Ukrainian territory. And the response of the United States and the West was sanctions and such. But do you think it was enough of a response? It doesn't seem like it in retrospect, but again, we can't only judge in retrospect. But talk about the American, the Western response to this, and whether you think it emboldened Putin to take the steps that he took last year.
Yeah, I would take you back even further in time to 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia and grabbed 2 hunks of territory, declared them independent, and the U.S. and the West basically did nothing. No sanctions. I mean, there was a couple of statements, but there was no penalty for Russia invading a sovereign state on its southern border, none. And so you learn a lesson from that, right? If you're President Putin, or frankly anybody else, that there may be some tough talk, but the U.S. and the West are not going to stand up for partners and allies in the former Soviet Union. And so fast forward to 2014 in the first war. And as you pointed out, there were some sanctions, a number of sanctions that were levied. Putin was kicked out of the G8. It became the G7. There was a lot of tough talk. He was a bit of a pariah, but he was able to withstand it, and the Russian economy was able to withstand it. And so he used the years between 2014 and 2022 to build up his military, to pause, refresh, or rearm, and wait until the right strategic moment. And the whole time there was this low-level war going on in Ukraine, in the eastern part of Ukraine. It didn't usually make the headlines in the United States, but every week 3 or 4 Ukrainians died. And that was headline-making stuff for Ukrainian families. Sometimes they were soldiers, sometimes they were just civilians that were, in the wrong village at the wrong time. It was pretty catastrophic and very destabilizing, I think, for Ukraine. And in addition to that kinetic part of Russia's war against Ukraine during these years, there were constant cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, economic attacks. I mean, the list goes on of how Russia was, attacking through means other than war, I guess one could call it, the state of Ukraine. And then, I guess Putin decided the stars were in alignment. Europe looked weak. The U.S. looked weak after our withdrawal from Afghanistan. He thought he had the strongest military in the world. And apparently he believed that the Ukrainian people would welcome the Russian army into Kyiv.
Do you think he really believed that?
Yeah, I guess I do. And, there are stories about how the high-ranking brass that was in that infamous 40-kilometer-long line of vehicles going to Kyiv, they had packed their dress uniforms because they were going to get to Kyiv pretty quickly. There was going to be a new ruler installed, a puppet government, and there would be a victory parade. And so they needed their dress uniforms for that. So I think there was a lot of magical thinking going on the part of Putin himself, but also those around him.
So one of the interesting things in those early days of the war was that there was not, at least in the West, certainly in this country, an expectation that the Ukrainians would be able to resist the mighty Red Army, so to speak, coming in and would sweep everything before it. And this would be a fait accompli. But it turned out that was not the case.
Yeah.
And so how, you're out of the embassy by this point, but nonetheless.
And out of the government.
Right, but you know what the dynamic is. So we seem to change our approach and our understanding of what was happening and what we could do about this relatively quickly. That is to say, the Ukrainians are resisting, the Russians are not marching in, and even perhaps better from the American point of view, the Russians are being exposed as tactically incompetent. Their military is not functioning well. Their equipment is outdated and breaking down. What, in your view, was the U.S. seeing that sparked this turnaround in the attitude of what the Ukrainians might be able to accomplish?
Yeah, so not everybody discounted the Ukrainian effort, and I'm proud to say that I'm one of those people. Because I've spent 6 years of my life in Ukraine, and I know the Ukrainian people, and I knew that they were going to resist, and I knew that they were going to be at least partly successful. I mean, I can't tell you that if you had asked me a year ago, in February of 2022, would I have said that the Ukrainian military would still be fighting hard and, just delivered, a defeat in Bakhmut 2 days ago February on the 9th, Victory Day, to the Russians. I'm not sure I would have predicted that. But I knew that there would be a lot of fight and that the Russians had another thing coming to them. And sure enough, that was the case. But I would say that I actually think the Biden government has done a really good job in terms of supporting Ukraine. Is it enough? No. We need more. We need to be sending more weapon systems, more economic assistance, faster so that Ukraine can win. Because that is critical, absolutely critical for Ukraine. For Ukraine's existence, but it's also critical, I think, for the West and the United States.
Do you believe Ukraine can win, and what do you mean by win?
So I think Ukraine can win, but only with a lot of Western assistance. And so I think that's going to be absolutely critical. And the other thing I would say is Ukraine must win. Ukraine must win in order for the country of Ukraine to continue to exist. But that's geography. It's also for the people of Ukraine to be able to continue to exist and speak the Ukrainian language and enjoy their culture and religion. Because if they stop fighting, if they don't win, they will be killed. I mean, there are two options here. It's binary. And Putin has made that very, very clear. But here's the other reason that Ukraine must win. It's because it's in our national security interests. Putin has made it very explicit that if he is successful in Ukraine, he's going to keep on going. He doesn't believe in, kind of the international rules-based order that was created after World War II by, among other countries, the Soviet Union, various other stakeholders around the world, to enshrine principles like sovereignty and the inviolability of borders and human rights and various other things that kind of give us the principles, but also by which nation states are supposed to govern their affairs and their relations with each other, but also the institutions and the expectations and so forth. And this is not a perfect system. And I think over the years, especially over the last 20 years, we've realized that we need to make a lot of reforms in this system, not only to be more reflective of the world that exists today rather than the world of 1945. But also to be more fit for purpose for the challenges we have today, which we didn't foresee back in 1945 and the ensuing years. But For all of its weaknesses and flaws, I would say that the international rules-based order, those institutions, I think of the UN, I think of the World Bank, the IMF, and the principles that we base our bilateral and multilateral relationships on, they have kept, I think, more people more secure, more prosperous, and more free than at any other time in human history. I mean, that's not a bad track record. Mm-hmm. And so before we let Vladimir Putin throw all that out the window because he is for, a Hobbesian might makes right kind of world where he gets to do what he wants because Russia is a big, powerful state, and so Russia just gets to do what it wants. That isn't certainly not in Ukraine's interest. It's not in our interests either. We may be a big and powerful country, but if that kind of Hobbesian big countries get to do what they want and the other countries need to put up with it, think of what that will do to supply chains. Think of what it will just do to discourse among countries. And how are we going to solve the really big issues that are facing us that no one country can solve? We all need to be in it together. And so I think that this is truly in our national security that we help Ukraine stop Vladimir Putin and Russia in Ukraine. Because if that does not happen, Vladimir Putin is going to keep on going. And, I think we will have to manage, whatever ensues, and there will probably be a conflict with Russia, at a later time that may be not to our advantage. So, as far as I'm concerned, better to, just handle this right now because the stakes are so high.
The Biden administration has, over the course of the last year or so, gradually increased the lethality of the equipment that it has sent over to the Ukrainians, as have NATO allies as well. But they are still holding back in certain ways because there is a calculus of how far can we go? Do we want the Ukrainians to have the capacity to reach into Russia, which the Ukrainians have said they don't want to do? But
they have their own ways of reaching into Russia.
Right. And so, that has kept certain kinds of aircraft and such from being sent. But do you think those limits should be taken off in terms of the weaponry that we're sending?
So I'm not a military expert, but here's what I would say. I'm glad that there is a robust discussion within our government about what should we be providing to Ukraine or any country, how should we be doing that, and what are the possible repercussions, and consequences of doing so. But I do think that there's been, that the conversation about what the repercussions are is a conversation we're having amongst ourselves, trying to imagine what is in Vladimir Putin's head. He's not a part of that conversation. We don't actually know what his red lines are. Sometimes he'll tell us. He told us at the beginning of the war that economic sanctions are an act of war and there will be consequences. And that, people don't remember that, but, people are like, oh, should we be laying on sanctions? And we laid on the sanctions and, there was nothing. When Finland and Sweden changed decades of their foreign policy, to request to join NATO. Again, there were threats from Vladimir Putin. And again, nothing happened. He doesn't talk about that anymore because you wouldn't want to remind your own countrymen of the disastrous consequences of your own foreign policy decisions. And kind of the list goes on. So I think that we need to be careful, we need to be mindful, but we shouldn't be self-deterred. We have interest in this as well, and I think we need to provide Ukraine with as much as possible, as quickly as possible, so that this war ends, and ends quickly, and ends on terms that Ukraine can live with.
President Zelensky has essentially said, we will fight until all the Russians are out of all our territories. That's right. Victory. From the U.S. point of view, do you think that's achievable? But even more to the point, do you think that is where we should be aligning in terms of what we see as the end of this?
Well, President Biden has said repeatedly, and I think he means it, that the Ukrainians are fighting this war and they get to decide what the terms are, and so I think that's where we need to line up. I would say that consistent polling in Ukraine shows that the Ukrainian people are maybe not 100%, but certainly in the high 80s percent, saying, we want to fight on and we don't want any concessions to Russia. It's very unified. The Ukrainian people are very unified on this, and they are taking heavy losses. I mean, this is a war that is being fought on their territory. They are losing, a generation of young men and many young women as well. And you've all seen the attacks on the civilians of Ukraine, on the civilian infrastructure and on people themselves. So this is a total war and by Russia against innocent people. And those people are standing up and saying, no, we are not going to let this happen. Because I think the fear is that if there are compromises, that those compromises will be Ukrainian compromises, not Russian compromises, that Russia will be rewarded yet again for invading a sovereign country, and that they just can't allow that because if Russia is seen to be even semi-victorious, Russia will keep on going. They'll just wait until we look away.
So Tom Friedman just wrote in the Times about all of this, and in his account of this, as he's describing or imagining what had happened, he says, Putin had a plan A, which you described before, which is quick victory and no real problems. But he never had a plan B. He never understood that what's happening now was a real possibility. And according to Friedman's assessment, he says Putin has put himself in a position where he can't win, he can't lose, and he can't stop.
Right.
And so the theory here is that one way out for Putin is a kind of brinksmanship with the U.S. to sort of make this a much higher stakes activity that brings us in a way that potentially threatens us in very significant ways. You said before that our previous concerns about Putin's reaction turned out to be for naught because he didn't react to the sanctions or the NATO enlargement or whatever. But are you concerned that this essentially direct confrontation between the U.S. and Russia that may automatically go to at least the threat of what an exchange would mean in terms of nuclear weapons, is that something obviously people have to take it into account as they're thinking about all of this? Mm-hmm. But in terms of where Friedman lays this out, do you think that is maybe the way Putin has to play this at some point because he's not winning the war?
Right. So, so the short answer is I don't know. But I would say that Putin and his entourage have made both direct and veiled threats about using nuclear weapons, and by that they mean tactical nuclear weapons. And anytime, just saying those words, I think there's an emotional response in everybody in this room, right? Because you don't want to get that calculus wrong. Of all decisions. But we could go through all of the reasons why it's not a very smart military decision for Putin to use tactical nukes in Ukraine, starting with that he would poison his own troops. Secondly, the political ramifications of Putin using nukes, I think would be devastating for him. We talk about the strong support for Ukraine in the US and in the West and a number of other countries. But there are a number of countries that are, on the sidelines. They're watching and waiting to see what's going to happen. And I think those countries, if nuclear weapons were used by Russia, I think they would be moved off of the sidelines. Mm-hmm. So I think there are all sorts of consequences to Russia getting into this. So do you want to solve the issue by making a bigger problem, direct confrontation with the US and the West? And I don't think so, because that's not what we've seen so far. Putin has been, or the Russian military has been pretty careful to date not to they're careful about when they send rockets into Western Ukraine so that it doesn't go into Poland and other neighboring countries, some of which are NATO countries. They're less careful when it comes to the Black Sea, but that is also true of other areas. So this is, fighter pilots going up against each other and, creating really dangerous situations where they fly too close to the wing or to the nose of an airplane. But the fact of the matter is the Russians have been doing this for a very, very long time, for years. And it just doesn't, previously it just didn't get that much play. I'm not saying it's a good practice. I'm not saying it isn't completely irresponsible and unsafe and couldn't lead to bigger things. But the Russians have been doing this for years, and so it isn't necessarily a new behavior. It's pretty clear that when Putin first started talking about using nuclear weapons, that there was a lot of diplomacy going on behind the scenes. I mean, yes, we made public statements, but we also made a lot of private statements. There was, I think, a fairly high-level meeting in Turkey where we made very clear to the Russians what would happen if they used nuclear weapons. And I think we, also used multilateral diplomacy to talk to, China, India, other countries who have their own interests in this issue, and in Russia not using nuclear weapons. And the Chinese came out, quite strongly on that. So, what we've seen to date, which doesn't mean that things couldn't change in the future, but what we've seen to date is that, when confronted by the U.S. directly on the use of nuclear weapons, verbally, there's been no action from Russia. And, the action along, sort of Western Ukraine and the bordering NATO countries has been careful. I don't think he wants to widen the war. He can't beat the Ukrainian military. He's going to take on NATO? I just don't see it.
Yeah, okay. Let's see if we have any questions from our audience here. We have some folks with microphones, so you must wait for a microphone. Let's see, gentleman here.
Hi, how's it going? Thanks for the conversation today. I really appreciated it. I wanted to ask a question. Actually, I had an assumption I wanted to share with you now that you're here. When Biden left Afghanistan just a few months ago, about maybe a year ago or so, I thought, he's focusing on Ukraine now. He's going to focus on military equipment industry on Ukraine now. So I wanted to confirm with you if that assumption is true or valid, that now that we're pulled out of Afghanistan, which we saw as a national security concern in the early 2000s after 9/11, that is a valid justification or valid idea that the U.S. is more focused on Ukraine now and pulling out of the region. And also, we talked about the region before with Poland and the Black Sea. The longer this war goes on, how will this war, or could this war potentially destabilize the region and cause further security concerns in your view?
Yeah. I don't think that the Biden administration was trying to exchange one war for another one. I think they were hoping to end, U.S. involvement support for overseas wars. I think that's where the mood of the American people certainly was in the summer of whatever that was, 2021. I wasn't in government at that time, but I don't think that that's the way it was coming down. I think that this war is very dangerous for the region. We've seen some of the repercussions where, we just talked about Finland and Sweden wanting to join NATO as a result. Other countries, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, there are a lot of fracture lines there. And everybody's trying to figure out, what does this mean for my country, and how can I figure out, how can I become stronger? How can I use this to my advantage? How is it going to disadvantage me? How dangerous is this for me? And so there's a lot of movement in all of those countries, and that is certainly something to watch. And then, you just look at the reaction of the bordering countries. Look at Poland. And look at the Baltic states. We've already talked about the Scandinavian states. They know what it would mean to have a long war in Ukraine, or God forbid that Ukraine would be defeated. They know what that would mean for them. And that's why you have a country like Estonia that has basically turned over all of its armaments to Ukraine. Because, this is where the front line is. This is where our front line is if you're Estonian. And I think that this is a very, very dangerous situation. certainly the most dangerous situation that I've seen in my lifetime.
Great. Mr. Ambassador, welcome. We'll get you a mic. Hang on a second.
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to express my admiration for your career and for what you've done in Ukraine. I've been appointed the vice minister after the Revolution of Dignity, and I was in charge of multilateral diplomacy, but I was observing your courageous statement and the high degree of integrity. In December 1994, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum. In April 2023, Clinton, interviewed by the Irish TV, said that basically he regrets, and because he said, I felt a stake in Ukrainian fate. I'm personally and professionally believe that there was no choice for Ukraine but to join the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. But can you share with us any comment, especially now when so many exchange of letters between Yeltsin and Clinton were recently declassified by the United States, and the truth and many elements of that discussion between the United States government and the Russian Federation on the eve of the Budapest summit now come to light. Can you share with us your comments, whether you believe that Ukraine had to be treated differently on the eve of Budapest Memorandum and thereafter? Mm-hmm. Because how I see it, and once again, I'm in favor of Ukraine's membership of the NPT, but how I see it, Ukraine's destiny and concerns were of secondary, if not tertiary, consideration for the purposes of making Ukraine sign the Budapest Memorandum. And that was one of many things that happened that eventually led us all to the situation where Putin was beyond control. Same thing you mentioned 2008, when parts of Georgia were invaded, and it took just several months for the United States to go to Geneva and to restart the relationship between the United States and Russia as if nothing happened. And Secretary Clinton was there in Geneva, and I see her now more or less often, and I'm encouraged how strong she is today when she speaks about the war of Russia against Ukraine. So it seems like both her husband and herself have undergone certain evolution of their thinking about what happened in the 90s and in early 2000s. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So for everybody else in the audience, it's so nice to see you, Ambassador. Ambassador Kyslytsya is Ukraine's representative at the UN and doing a masterful job of advancing Ukrainian and world interests at the UN. It's great to see you here. Thank you for coming. Yeah. So you put a lot on the table just now. I'll try to answer, and I have to admit that I have not read the recently declassified letters that you referred to, so I can't really address what's in them. But just to remind everybody, back in the 1990s when the Soviet Union fell apart, and there were 4 republics, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, that had nuclear weapons, previously under the Soviet Union, but all of a sudden 3 new nuclear countries. And there were real concerns in the United States, and I think in other countries as well, as to what was going to happen with these nuclear stocks. Because maintaining nuclear weapons is highly skilled work, right? And it's very, very expensive. And, most of these countries were almost bankrupt at this point. And so were they going to be able to maintain the weapons? Were they going to be able to protect the weapons and secure them in a way that, so that terrorists or just criminals wouldn't be able to get them. And I think that was when the phrase loose nukes was spawned, because we were really afraid of what the consequences would be. Not to mention that we didn't, I mean, I think nobody wanted even more nuclear states. So Russia was negotiating with the other three republics about getting the nuclear weapons under Russia under Russian control, and asked for our help with Ukraine, because Ukraine was, as I recall, I mean, I was not involved in these negotiations, and so we helped because we thought that this would be in everybody's interest, including Ukraine, which we made an assessment, which may not be true, but we made an assessment that Ukraine wouldn't be able to properly store and protect these weapons. So Ukraine, in the end, did decide, under a lot of pressure, to give up its nukes. And in exchange, the Budapest Memorandum was written. And that was a memorandum that was signed by Russia, Ukraine, the UK, and the US. And we provided assurances, not guarantees, assurances, that the borders of Ukraine were, these are not the exact words, but the borders of Ukraine were inviolable, and there would not be the use of force or the threat of the use of force against Ukraine. Russia signed that. And so that, is, kind of, the document that was supposed to assure Ukraine that there would be no problems and we would all stand by that. The US wasn't going to invade, Russia wasn't going to invade, the UK wasn't going to invade. Russia, of course, violated that. And so then there was, back in 2014, there were real questions as to what does that mean for us? But the US, we looked at the document. It was very clear it was assurances, which is different from guarantees. But those are legal arguments. They're not like human arguments. I mean, when I was working for the US government, I arrived in 2016. I had this conversation numerous times. And, it's just really hard to justify, because what people understood, even if the negotiators in the room understood that this did not mean that we were going to put boots on the ground to defend Ukraine, that's not what Ukrainian citizens understood. And it certainly wasn't what they understood in 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time. And, so fast forward to today. And I think that, hindsight is 20/20, as we say. I think at the time, I'm sure that President Clinton thought he was doing the right thing, even if he was really pressuring Ukraine hard. Obviously, there were all sorts of unforeseen repercussions that have played out very, very badly. And so, now when we think about that time when the war is over, and in Ukraine, and there is, all wars end, and most wars end with some sort of negotiation. So what does that mean for Ukraine in terms of what kind of guarantees the West can provide to Ukraine for Ukraine to be able to put down arms and believe that the same thing isn't going to happen all over again, and we're going to watch this movie again over and over again. And it has to be big enough so that Russia is deterred, and it has to be big enough so that Ukraine is, I hate to use the word assured, but it feels confident that history is not going to repeat itself. And I think that is one of the big issues that the US and other countries need to grapple with.
Well, we've gotten through a lot, and I think we're going to stop here. But you can see this is a long history, but it is really on the edge right now.
And we only did 30 years.
And, so much that's so dramatic that we see every day in the paper, and that, we recognize what the Russians have done and the valor of what the Ukrainians have done to defend themselves. And you were in the middle of just understanding what this was for all those years. And so much of the background for this, you will find much more of it in the book. So please join me in thanking Ambassador Yovanovitch, who'll be signing books outside after the program. Thank you.